on letter B in your outline, the diencephalon. So if you look at your outline, the diencephalon has several regions associated with it. There's the thalamus, which is the biggest part of the diencephalon. There's the hypothalamus, and there's the pineal gland, which is also known as the epithalamus. And then there's other structures that you can see under that line 1 through 5 that we'll talk about as well. So let's take a look at the biggest region, which is called the thalamus. So this is an egg-shaped area that's deep inside your brain. It is gray matter. So let's take a look at where we are. If you remember, our brain contains white and gray matter. And I highlighted the thalamus here for you. It's not crazy gray, but there is some gray here. It's going to be interrupted by some white running through and down. But it is this deeper region of gray matter within the brain. If we look at it from the lateral view, okay, so our mid-sagittal view here, the thalamus is this area. It's an egg-shaped region, so it's kind of like a little oval, and it's gray matter. So let's look at it with the position, right? So it's going to be inferior to or caudal to our corpus callosum here. This very glossy sheet is called the septum pellucidum. So remember, there's that connective tissue that separated the two lateral ventricles. So that's the septum pellucidum. It's invisible, it's clear, but I can see that it's shiny. Then there is another structure called the fornix that I haven't gotten to yet. This is part of the limbic system. And then here is the thalamus. Okay, so what is the thalamus exactly? Let's go back to our cartoon of it. So it's divided up into regions called nuclei. And one of the things you need to remember in the brain is that the word nucleus has another meaning. So you guys all know the nucleus is inside a cell. It contains all of our DNA inside the cell. But when you talk about neurology or neurobiology, a nucleus is an area of the brain that contains neurons that perform very similar or similar structure functions. So you can see that each color here is going to be something called a nucleus, and they're all going to have discrete functions. So in your outline, it's an egg-shaped paired structure. So the two sides or the hemispheres of the thalamus are going to be connected by the intermediate mass. So let's take a look at what that looks like in a diagram. So this is the brain model that you would have in class, but it's going to be very, very similar to any brain diagram that you have. So this little structure right here, that's going to be your intermediate mass. Do your diagram that is very similar to the one in your lab notebook. So we're looking for our thalamus, which is this area right here, this circular egg shape. That dot in the center is going to be our intermediate mass, right? Connects the two sides of our thalamus. Okay, so it has about 12 major nuclei. It's gray matter, and it's going to integrate a lot of information coming in from different parts of our body. So if you see the functions, this is a pared down function of your thalamus. It's a relay station for all senses except for smell. So what that means is from the spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord is our sort of railway station from our body to our brain. So if you feel something with your hands, that sensation is going to come up your spinal cord. That feeling is going to come into the thalamus, right? So that feeling is traveling on an axon of a neuron. That axon will synapse here with another neuron within the thalamus and send that sensory information into, I'm going to ask you guys what lobe, right? So what lobe of the brain was responsible for receiving and integrating sensory information? So if you thought parietal lobe, you are correct. So that neuron, a second neuron, will then send that information into the parietal lobe so that your cerebrum can interpret and make sense of that information coming in. Okay, so all of your senses, your vision, if your eyes, which rest right here, there are some electrical impulses traveling into the brain. They're going to go into the thalamus. They're going to synapse with another neuron, and that second neuron that's in the thalamus will send that message to the occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex, right? So if we're hearing something, then the neuron is going to come in from our ear, our inner ear, is going to synapse with our thalamus and then send the information to our temporal lobe, right? Because our temporal lobe is the auditory cortex. So you kind of get the idea of how the thalamus is a relay station. The only sense that doesn't go there is smell, and I'll explain why with the limbic system. It has a role in motor function, and letter C, the thalamus stores and receives memories with the hippocampus. So it's a very complex little area right here, the thalamus. All right, so let's look at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, let's stay with our diagram here. Hypo means below, so we're going to go down, and it's this region right here is our hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus starts with the letter H, and I want you to think about homeostasis, starting with the letter H, because the hypothalamus is going to maintain a lot of our homeostatic mechanisms. So let's look at letter B under number 2, the hypothalamus, which maintains homeostasis. So the hypothalamus is going to have a role in regulating our sleep-wake cycles, our thirst, our body temperature, our water balance, sexual arousal, emotions, hunger. So a lot of our, those autonomic sort of housekeeping homeostatic mechanisms are going to be controlled here in the brain, the hypothalamus. So that's that. It does secrete 2 hormones itself, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Let me just mention that oxytocin is a hormone that has received a lot of sort of popular scientific news, and it's known as the bonding hormone of your body, but it is secreted in times where there is bonding happening. So it's secreted after the birth of a baby, so the mother bonds with the baby, and it's secreted after sexual intercourse. It's secreted in different amounts in different times of your life, but that's why it's been given the name the bonding hormone. It's not that simple, it's more complicated than that. So but that is one of the things. The other job that the oxytocin does is it helps to stimulate the contraction of smooth muscle during childbirth, for example. It helps to squeeze, to give signals for the uterus to contract, so if you can have a baby there. So the next hormone, antidiuretic hormone, is a hormone that's secreted to keep water in your body. So you know that the word diuretic probably means, or you know that it probably, you probably know that it means that a diuretic is something that forces you to go to the bathroom. So you lose urine, you lose water through your urine. So antidiuretic is a hormone that allows you to retain water, and it's actually very, very important. If you didn't have this hormone, you wouldn't be able to retain any of the water that you drank, and so you'd constantly feel thirsty, you'd constantly want to drink water. So that's an important hormone to keep hydrated. So those are the 2. And then it controls, letter D, it controls a hormone secreted by the pituitary gland. So you see how this structure here, there's a little stalk, and then there's this widened pituitary gland. So this pituitary gland I talked about before in the bones when we talked about the sella turcica, and how there's a little depression called the hypophyseal fossa in the sella turcica, and that the pituitary gland, another name for that is called the hypophysis. So that is, so here it is. This is your hypophysis, or your pituitary gland, that is encased in your sella turcica. And this is because it's a critical gland of your body. It controls many, many hormones that are produced, and it's critical for survival. So that's that. So if you look down at other structures of the diencephalon, number 1 is the pituitary gland, and number 2 is the infundibulum. So the infundibulum is this little stalk, this little guy that hangs down, and it connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus has hormones that it sort of disperses down the infundibulum and then reaches the pituitary gland, and that controls whether the pituitary gland itself secretes more hormone. So this is the ultimate control mechanism, the hypothalamus. All right. So back to letter A, which I didn't mention. The hypothalamus controls autonomic nervous system. It controls your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So big job there. And let's move on to number 3, the pineal gland. So staying with our little diagram here, the pineal gland is this structure here. It is known as the epithalamus, And the epithalamus secretes hormones. It's actually a hormone secreting structure. The hormone is called melatonin. So a lot of you guys have probably heard of melatonin. This is a hormone that is produced to make you feel sleepy. Let's just take a look at this other diagram. I'm sorry, this is our brain model. So this teardrop shaped structure right there, that is our pineal gland or our epithalamus. And so let's briefly, what melatonin does is that it does make you feel sleepy, and it's secreted when it starts to get dark. So there's a feedback mechanism with your eyes. When your eyes start to detect darkness or less light, their levels of melatonin in your brain start to rise. And in that rising of melatonin, you start to feel sleepy. Now, this is a little bit of a discrepancy here. Feeling sleepy and being able to fall asleep are two different things. Speaking from as a person who lives with a person who has insomnia, my husband has insomnia, he feels sleepy a lot, but he doesn't necessarily fall asleep when he feels sleepy. So melatonin is a sleepy hormone. So if you don't have insomnia, you probably will fall asleep when you feel sleepy, but for some people there's another issue at hand. All right, so let's take a look at our other structures here. Number 3 is the optic chiasm. So let me show you in this picture here. So when your eye, which is going to rest here, it's going to receive information. The optic nerve will come back into the brain, and then the optic nerve is going to do a cross. It physically forms a crisscross, an X, and then this here is what you see of that cross. So this is called the optic chiasm. In your diagram in your lab manual, it's this structure right here. So just imagine your eye, the optic nerve traveling in this fashion towards your optic chiasm where it crosses. Let me show you another image so you can have a better understanding. You see how this and this, these are your two optic nerves, and you see how they come together and they form an X. So this right here, that center of the X, that's your optic chiasm. And if you imagine pulling these two halves apart and just looking at the mid-sagittal section, then you would see basically this. Okay, so that's your optic chiasm. The next, number 4, is the third ventricle. So ventricles are tricky because you can't see them, right? They're just a space. And so the third ventricle is going to be in this general area of the thalamus. This pink structure here is the choroid plexus of that third ventricle. So in this image, this is the choroid plexus of your third ventricle, okay? So let's just review some other structures. You see this band of tissue on top of our choroid plexus? This is the fornix, right? That's part of your limbic system. I haven't gotten to that yet. Then we have this big area here. This is the tissue that covers up our lateral ventricle. So this is going to be our septum pellucidum. All right, the septum pellucidum is going to cover up our lateral ventricle. And then this guy, this really big one, hopefully you recognize this by now, this is corpus callosum. Okay, so remember the corpus callosum was a commissural fiber, and how we had 2 more commissures. So I'm going to show you this because your brain image in your lab manual is not as detailed as others that I have seen. So in this model that you would have in class, here, this little structure here, that is our anterior commissure, right? So the commissures connect 2 sides of the hemispheres. This is the anterior commissure. And then back here, you see this little bump? This is our posterior commissure. Now, a lot of students will get the posterior commissure mixed up with our pineal gland. So what I say in class is that your pineal gland looks like a little pine cone or teardrop, and your 2 commissures are sort of round. Okay, so those are those structures. So here's our optic chiasm. This is our infundibulum. This is our pituitary gland. And let's look at the last thing. This is the mammillary body. So you see this rounded structure here. You have 2 of them, right? 2 mammillary bodies. But since we're only looking at half the brain, I can see 1 bump. If we want to look at the bottom, oop, we can't see it here. It's covered up by the pituitary gland. But you would actually see two bumps. In this image, we have here, right? That's our mammillary body. if I said gland, I can't remember now. It's not a mammary gland. Mammary glands are different than a mammillary body. So please be conscious of that mammillary body. So it's part of our limbic system. It houses eating reflexes, like suckling for the baby. It has a lot of other jobs. I didn't list them all, but that is a structure that's also involved in homeostasis. All right, so I think we're done with this diencephalon. So let's just do, a review again. So let's take a look at an actual human brain. So we have our corpus callosum here, right? That's a commissural fiber. And honestly, I cannot see an anterior and posterior commissure on this real human brain, so I won't mention them. This area underneath our corpus callosum is going to be the lateral ventricle, but that sheet that is clear in front of it is called the septum pellucidum. Then we're going to have the other structure called the fornix, and underneath the fornix we're going to have a space. That space is going to be called the third ventricle. Now, you see where my cursor is right here? If I put my finger in that brain, it would allow my finger to fit in, and I could sort of move my finger back and forth. That's just like I'm moving the cursor here. So it's a gap. So that's our third ventricle. You can see the sort of blood vascular network here. That's going to be the choroid plexus that secretes cerebrospinal fluid. We can see our pineal gland, right? That secretes melatonin, the hormone to make you feel sleepy. This general area, the egg-shaped region, is our thalamus. I do not see an intermediate mass, okay? Down here is going to be our hypothalamus, and then we have all these other things. So this is our optic chiasm, right, where the optic nerve, which is here, comes in. This is the crisscross. And then we have our infundibulum would be here, except it's been cut away, and then hanging and attached to the infundibulum would be our pituitary gland, which is not pictured. Then we have our mammillary body here. Okay, so that's all we've talked about so far. So this general region that I'm sort of encircling here with my cursor, that is going to be the diencephalon. All right, so the next lecture will be on the brainstem.